"If it blows," Sergeant Vance said, tightening one last bolt, "then we know where it breaks. If it doesn't, then we know how to win." England, November 1944. Rain lashes against a corrugated tin hangar at Laken Airfield. Inside, a half-frozen ground crew stand in a circle around a single P-51 Mustang, stripped down, its Merlin engine glistening under the dim yellow of a work light. Steam rises off the floor. The smell of oil, rain and fear hangs in the air. Sergeant Silas Ace Vance stands with a cigarette dangling from his mouth and a wrench in his hand. His coveralls are filthy, his eyes bloodshot. He hasn't slept in 20 hours. Behind him, someone mutters, "He's lost it this time. He's going to blow the damn thing." Vance doesn't look up. "If it blows," he says, tightening one last bolt on the throttle linkage, "then we know where it breaks. If it doesn't, then we know how to win." The P-51's Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650 engine has never been pushed past 67 inches of manifold pressure. The manual says that's the red line, the point where the pistons start melting and the crankshaft can snap like a matchstick. But Vance isn't interested in manuals. He grew up in Detroit tuning engines by ear, not by regulation. "Engines don't read orders," he'd always say. "They just tell you what they want if you listen right." The pilots standing nearby, mostly young men with nervous eyes, shift uneasily. Captain James Racer Riley, a 2-3-year-old ace with 3 confirmed kills, leans against a toolbox. "You sure about this, Silas?" he asks. Vance exhales a thin plume of smoke. "Nope," Riley grins despite himself. "Then we're even." Outside, the rain starts to fall harder. The crew rolls the P-51 out into the open. The sound of the storm mixes with the metallic clank of chains and the rumble of distant bombers returning from missions. Vance climbs onto the wing and peers into the cockpit. He's rewired the throttle linkage by hand, bypassing the factory limiters, sealing the fuel manifold with a piece of copper tubing, chewing gum, and prayer. It's the kind of modification that could get him court-martialed or promoted. "Fire her up," he says. The engine coughs once, twice, then ignites. A thunderous roar fills the hangar. The Mustang shudders, tail lashing against its chains. The propeller becomes a silver blur. Blue fire licks out of the exhaust stacks. The gauges climb. 60 inches, 65, 70. The needle trembles at 80. Everyone ducks for cover. Vance doesn't move. The noise becomes a scream, the sound of mechanical defiance. The floor shakes. Tools fall off benches. And then, impossibly, the engine stabilizes. The vibrations smooth out. The roar becomes steady, powerful, controlled. The Merlin isn't dying. It's alive. Vance stares at the gauges, eyes wide, heart pounding. For a moment, nobody breathes. Then Riley yells over the noise. "It's holding, it's really holding." Vance smirks. "Told you the book's wrong." The engine keeps roaring against the storm until the entire hangar rattles. Rain hammers the roof. Lightning flashes through the open door, illuminating the words stenciled on the Mustang's fuselage, "The Reckless." When Vance finally cuts the power, the sudden silence is deafening. Steam rises from the exhaust ports, glowing orange in the dark. The men look at each other, half in disbelief, half in awe. One of the crew mutters, "He's out of his damn mind." Riley wipes the rain off his face and answers quietly, "Maybe, but that kind of crazy just changed the war." The sound of cooling metal fills the hangar. Outside, thunder rolls across the English countryside. And somewhere above the clouds, the Luftwaffe is flying on borrowed time. For most pilots and mechanics in 1944, the Merlin engine was both a miracle and a minefield. It gave the P-51 Mustang its unmatched reach, 6 hours of endurance, 440 miles per hour of fury. But it was temperamental, finicky, and utterly unforgiving if mishandled. Manuals described its limits like holy scripture: 61 inches of manifold pressure for combat, 67 inches for war emergency, and never under any circumstance more than that. Every flight crewman had heard the same horror stories. A few seconds of overboost and the pistons would melt, oil lines rupture, the supercharger explode. One airman at Debden swore he saw a Merlin disintegrate mid-takeoff. The propeller sheared off, the engine block thrown 50 yards. The wreck caught fire before the pilot even unbuckled. The verdict: pilot error. Overboost. Case closed. Engines don't forgive arrogance, said the manuals. Follow procedure or pay the price. But Silas Vance never believed in sacred numbers. To him, those limits weren't mechanical. They were bureaucratic. Paper rules for men who didn't have to face gunfire. He'd spent years back in Detroit listening to engines on assembly lines, tuning Fords and Buicks by ear, learning that every machine had its own rhythm. When he joined the Army Air Forces, he brought that instinct with him. The RAF treated their Merlin like porcelain dolls, running them gently, nursing every pound of boost. The Americans, by contrast, pushed their planes hard, but even they stopped short of 70 inches. They didn't dare go further until Vance. He'd spent months watching P-51 seconds limp home, oil-soaked and sputtering, not because of bullets, but because they couldn't climb fast enough to escape. He'd seen pilots shot down while throttling back to safe boost levels. He'd buried friends who obeyed the manual too faithfully. So, when command sent down another batch of factory-sealed instructions stamped, "Do not modify," he crumpled the paper and tossed it into the oil drum. "Engines don't read orders," he muttered. "They just answer questions. You just got to ask the right one." To Vance, the question was simple. What happens if we stop being afraid of the red line? He spent nights pacing the hangar, his cigarette glowing like a fuse. He wasn't reckless. He was methodical. He tested airflow by hand, marking heat shifts across the manifold with chalk, listening for what he called the change in heartbeat. He began sketching a bypass system on a scrap of cardboard, a simple loop to redirect pressure around the carburetor under load. Most mechanics called it suicide. One officer called it sabotage. Vance called it curiosity. Word spread fast across the 357th Fighter Group, the Oxford Boys. Some crazy Detroit grease monkeys building a turbo bypass. Pilots rolled their eyes. If it worked, Rolls-Royce would have done it already. But Vance wasn't trying to impress Rolls-Royce. He was trying to save pilots. He once told a young mechanic, "The difference between an engine and a man is that a man quits when he's scared. An engine quits when you make a mistake." It was blasphemy in a world run by procedure. But war rewards blasphemers more than believers. And as the winter fog rolled in over England, Vance decided to test his heresy. He tightened one final bolt, adjusted the bypass valve with his fingers, and whispered to himself, "You've got to know where the edge is to win." Then he smiled, that half-mad, half-brilliant grin only mechanics understand, and said, "Tomorrow we find out if the Merlin's heart can handle the truth." Silas Ace Vance didn't look like a hero. He didn't wear wings, didn't salute properly, and smelled permanently of motor oil and cigarette smoke. Before the war, he was just another greased mechanic from Detroit, a man who could fix an engine blindfolded, but couldn't sit still behind a desk. He grew up in the hum of the auto plants. The rhythm of clanging presses and the hiss of steam were his lullabies. His father built engines for Packard. His mother worked on wiring harnesses. By the age of 12, Silas was rebuilding carburetors in their shed. At 16, he was racing pickup trucks on Woodward Avenue for cash. At 18, he was fired from 3 garages for unsafe experimentation. Unsafe meant fast. When the war came, the draft didn't find a soldier. It found a problem solver. The Army Air Forces shipped him to a maintenance depot in Florida, where he drove the instructors insane. When told to replace spark plugs by the manual, he'd reply, "The manual wasn't written by the guy who built it." When told to use regulation wrenches, he'd use his hands. But Vance wasn't insubordinate. He was too good. His engines ran smoother, faster, and lasted longer than anyone else's. By 1943, his name appeared on the recommendation list for overseas assignment. Candidate demonstrates unconventional proficiency in high-performance engine management. That was bureaucratic code for genius who won't follow orders. They sent him to England anyway. At Lakenheath, home of the 357th Fighter Group, the Oxford Boys Vance found his place. The hangars smelled like gasoline and rain. Pilots swaggered through puddles in leather jackets. Mechanics shouted over roaring test runs, and engines never slept. The pilots learned fast that Vance wasn't like the others. He didn't just fix planes. He read them. When a P-51 came in with rough compression, he didn't reach for a checklist. He listened, touched the manifold, felt the heat through his gloves. "That's number 3 cylinder starving," he'd say. "Then prove it." "Silas can hear metal talk," one flyer joked. Another replied, "No, he just scares it into working." But underneath the grin and grime was something heavier. Frustration. Every night, Vance watched pilots die in the sky because their machines weren't allowed to perform. The Luftwaffe's W-190 seconds and Me-109 seconds were still dangerous. But the new jets, the Me-262 seconds, were slaughtering bombers faster than anyone could adapt. Pilots came back shaken, cursing, "We can't catch them. We can't climb. We can't even breathe on them before they're gone." Vance hated that. He'd walk the flight line after dark, running his hands along the cooling cowls of Mustangs that barely limped home. "They've got more in them," he'd whisper. "They just need to be unchained." That obsession made him infamous. Officers warned him to stay within spec. Engineers called him a liability. Pilots called him a miracle worker. Captain Racer Riley once said, "If you see Vance crawling under your bird at midnight, don't stop him. Just thank him later." It was in those sleepless nights, surrounded by dripping oil cans, cigarette ash, and engine hum, that Vance began sketching the system that would change the air war. A copper bypass valve, a recalibrated linkage, and the nerve to push a $25,000 engine into uncharted pressure. To everyone else, it looked like insanity. To Vance, it was logic. "The Germans don't care what our red line says," he told Riley. "So why the hell should we?" The air smelled of rain and metal that night. A mechanic handed him a cup of cold coffee. "You really think it'll work?" Vance didn't answer right away. He stared at the horizon where bombers vanished into the clouds. Then softly, "I think if it doesn't, we're all dead anyway." That was all the permission he needed. The air war over Europe was a game of arithmetic, brutal, cold, and merciless. Every mechanic, every pilot, every planner understood that behind every heroic dogfight story lay a spreadsheet of attrition. Numbers didn't lie. They only bled in silence. The P-51 Mustang was the Allied miracle, but it was a miracle built on a knife's edge. It could fly 1,000 miles, escort bombers to Berlin, and tangle with German fighters at 25,000 feet. But the same engine that gave it that range, the Rolls-Royce Merlin V1000, 650, also turned it into a glass cannon. Push it too hard and it cracked. Treat it too softly and you died. Here's what the math said. Standard boost, 61 inches of manifold pressure. War emergency power, 67 inches for 5 minutes only. Catastrophic failure threshold, 72 inches. Overboost failure rate, roughly 1 in every 5 attempts. A single Merlin engine cost $25,000. Almost half the price of the entire airframe. In today's money, that's nearly $450,000 per engine. And that was before you counted the pilot, the plane, and the mission that engine was supposed to survive. Now compare that to the Luftwaffe's Me-109 seconds and Fu-190 seconds. Lighter, simpler, built for short bursts of combat. They could dive, fight, and escape within minutes of takeoff. But for Allied pilots flying 6-hour escort missions deep into Germany, a single engine failure over enemy territory meant capture, or worse. Vance saw the math every day on the maintenance logs. He saw what the officers didn't want to admit. Most of the Mustangs that never returned didn't go down to flak or gunfire. They went down because their engines gave out at the moment they were needed most. He started keeping a notebook, not for the pilots' kills, but for the engines that quit too soon. Engine number 4,872. Loss of oil pressure at 24 kVt. Number 5,013. Boost limit. Overheat, forced landing. Number 5,099. Pilot throttled back to save pressure. Jumped by full 190. Every page was the same pattern. A machine built to fight was being strangled by its own limitations. The war wasn't just about tactics or bravery. It was about flow, about how much pressure you could generate before the system failed, whether that system was steel, oil, or human nerve. Vance began running his own calculations. He borrowed data from RAF test reports, analyzed pressure curves, and even listened to old Packard factory recordings to understand where the Merlin's resonance began to distort. He wasn't a physicist. He didn't need to be. His hands were the instruments. His instincts were math. One night, a visiting aero-engine engineer saw him scribbling equations on the wall with a grease pencil. "You think you're smarter than Rolls-Royce now?" he asked mockingly. Vance didn't look up. "No," he said, "just braver." That answer spread across the base faster than the sound of the engines themselves. To some, he was a lunatic, chasing a red line that would kill him. To others, he was the only man asking the right question. What's the point of saving engines if we're losing men? The turning point came in early December. Reports from bomber crews showed that Luftwaffe interceptors were tearing into formations before escorts could reach altitude. The P-51 seconds were climbing too slowly. The Mi-109 seconds were picking off stragglers one by one. At a debrief, a pilot slammed his helmet onto the table. "We need more speed or we're dead." Vance just stood up from the corner of the room and said, "Then stop treating that engine like it's made of glass." Silence fell. He looked at the colonel dead in the eye. "Sir, you asked us to win, not to last." That was the day the math of fragility began to collapse. Because sometimes numbers don't end illusions. They dare you to break them. Lakenheath Airfield, December 12th, 1944. The clouds hung low, the ground soaked with mud and antifreeze, the kind of English morning that turned breath into fog and courage into madness. A dozen mechanics stood around a single silver Mustang with its cowling open, steam rolling off the Merlin block like breath from a beast. At its center was Silas Vance, sleeves rolled up, hands black with grease, tightening a copper bypass line that technically did not exist. He'd been up all night modifying the P-51's throttle linkage, rerouting manifold pressure around the carburetor. He sealed the joints with solder, gum, and a strip of aluminum from a mess hall tray. It looked insane, but he'd done the math. The mod would allow 80 inches of boost without the carburetor choking. It was mechanical heresy. Captain Racer Riley was the test pilot, because of course he was. He was reckless enough to trust Vance. As he pulled on his gloves, he grinned. "So, what do I tell the colonel if this thing explodes?" Vance didn't blink. "Tell him it was working fine before you touched it." The men laughed nervously. No one really wanted to see what would happen next, but no one could look away. The engine fired. The first cough echoed across the hangar, then turned into a thunderous, steady roar. The exhaust spat flames. The gauges climbed. 60 inches. 65. 70. Vance held his breath. The needle trembled. The sound deepened. Not frantic, not desperate. Stronger. The Merlin roared like it had been waiting for this moment all its life. "Throttle up," he shouted. Riley eased forward on the stick. The P-51 rolled onto the runway, tail twitching like a predator about to pounce. The other mechanics scattered for safety. The rain hissed against the canopy. "Ready?" Vance asked through the radio. Riley's voice crackled back. "Nope." He pushed the throttle to the firewall. The plane launched forward like it had been shot from a cannon. The sound wasn't an engine anymore. It was a scream, mechanical and human at once. The Mustang tore down the runway, its tires barely touching ground, lifting off in less than 700 feet. Vance ran outside, boots splashing through puddles, staring into the grey sky as the P-51 climbed straight up. Not a shallow ascent. Vertical. "Holy hell," someone whispered. At 10,000 feet, the Mustang was still accelerating. 15,000, 20,000. The engine was beyond red line, but the sound never wavered. Riley's voice came through the radio, breathless and half-laughing. "She's holding, Silas, she's really holding." The transmission cut out in static. Every man on the ground froze. Vance's heart sank. He knew what silence meant in war. He dropped his wrench, staring at the clouds. Seconds crawled by like hours. Then the roar returned. Distant at first, then louder. The P-51 broke through the overcast, rolling into a perfect dive. Contrails spiraling behind it like white ropes. Riley's voice came back giddy and disbelieving. "She's fast as hell. Gauges are red, but she's flying like she's free." Vance didn't cheer. He just watched, jaw tight, as the Mustang leveled off over the airfield and came in low, faster than he'd ever seen a piston plane move. The propeller tips shimmered blue from sheer speed. When the plane touched down, it didn't taxi. It growled. Riley shut down the engine and climbed out, face streaked with oil, eyes wide with adrenaline. "Well?" Vance asked. Riley grinned. "You're insane." Vance smirked back. "So's the engine." They walked around the Mustang, steam hissing from the cowl, the metal still ticking with heat. There were scorch marks on the manifold, cracked paint on the cowling, and the faint smell of burnt rubber, but nothing was broken. Vance knelt beside the plane and pressed his hand against the hot metal. "She didn't die," he said quietly. "She was just waiting to breathe." By nightfall, every pilot on base knew about the madman's run. And by morning, the colonel had ordered him to explain exactly how the hell a mechanic made a Mustang climb like a jet. Vance's answer was simple. "I stopped asking permission. When Silas Vance's P-51 screamed into the English clouds that morning, it didn't just climb. It shattered a barrier that no manual, engineer, or colonel could ever patch back together." The madman's run became the most whispered rumor on the base. Mechanics who once mocked him started sneaking into the hangar to study the mod. Pilots who'd sworn by the manual now begged him to do that thing to their Mustangs. At first, the numbers didn't make sense. The test data pulled from Riley's flight recorder showed climb rates that were impossible. Standard P-51D climb 3,200 feet per minute. Riley's test 4,700. Airspeed sustained at 28,000 feet, 40 pounds more than factory spec. Engine damage minimal, though every gauge was buried in the red. In 1 hour, a greasy mechanic from Detroit had rewritten the physics of American air combat. But that kind of power always came with danger. Not just from the machine, but from the bureaucracy it defied. When the engineering division got wind of the illegal modification, they demanded an investigation. The official report called it unauthorized pressure augmentation and classified it as sabotage. But something strange happened. Before the investigation even began, copies of Vance's design, the bypass loop, the valve tweak, the throttle reroute, had already spread to 6 other squadrons. It was too late to stop it. The modification was easy to replicate, impossible to trace, and undeniably effective. Mechanics across the 8th Air Force started calling it Vancing the Merlin. They'd laugh, solder copper pipes into place, and whispered, "If it blows, it goes," and the results spoke for themselves. In January 1945, Luftwaffe fighter interceptions began to plummet. The reason the P-51 seconds were climbing faster, engaging sooner, breaking German formations before they could even reach the bombers. The Air Force data from that winter told a silent story. Bomber losses dropped by 27%. Mustang engagement distances shortened by 15 miles on average. Luftwaffe sortie effectiveness fell by nearly 40%. Nobody could officially explain it, but everyone at Lakenheath knew. It was because of the mad test. Vance's fix forced the Air Force to confront an uncomfortable truth. The greatest innovation of the war hadn't come from a lab, a boardroom, or a test facility. It had come from a hangar floor in the rain, from a man who didn't believe in limits. By February, the modification had a new name: War Emergency Power. The term made it sound official, even noble. But the heart of it was pure Vance. Every P-51 now came with permission to push past its rated limit for 5 minutes in combat. 5 minutes of pure chaos, 5 minutes of speed that could mean life or death. Of course, no one ever credited him. The Army Air Forces couldn't admit their most vital performance boost came from a field sergeant and a tube of chewing gum. The technical bulletin read simply, "Approved modification, revised boost regulation system, sustained manifold pressure increase permitted under emergency combat conditions." That was bureaucracy's way of saying, "Don't ask how this exists." But among the pilots, it had a different name: the Vance switch. Every time a Mustang hit the clouds and its pilot slammed the throttle forward, they thought of him. The madman who listened to the engine instead of the rules. Vance himself didn't gloat. He kept working quietly, tuning engines, checking plugs, smiling when he saw the bombers come home in greater numbers. He told one young mechanic, "The Army will make it sound like science, but it was just guts." The kid asked him if he was proud. Vance chuckled. "Pride's for peacetime. Right now, I'm just glad they finally learned that red paint on a gauge doesn't stop a bullet." He was right. The Luftwaffe never recovered. By March, their aces were dying faster than they could be replaced. The sky, once ruled by the Germans, now belonged to the mad mechanics and their outlaw engines. Rules had lost. Reality had won. March 1945. The 357th Fighter Group was flying deep over Germany, escorting B-17 seconds on a raid bound for Berlin. The air was thin, the sunlight harsh, and the contrails stretched like silver scars across the blue. The Luftwaffe was dying, but not quietly. High above the bomber stream, 4 Me-109 seconds cut through the sky like scalpels, their supercharged Daimler-Benz engines screaming in the thin air. They were hunting for stragglers, waiting for one bomber to fall out of formation. Captain Racer Riley wasn't about to let that happen. He'd been there for the madman's run. He'd watched Silas Vance nearly blow up a plane to make it stronger. And now, as a swarm of German fighters closed in on his bombers, he reached down and flipped the switch hidden under his panel, the one Vance had wired by hand, the Vance switch. Instantly, the manifold pressure needle jumped. The Mustang's engine didn't complain. It screamed. Riley's body was crushed against his seat as his P-51 rocketed upward, climbing at an angle that no piston fighter was supposed to survive. His wingman shouted through the radio, "You're insane, you'll blow the block." Riley just laughed. "Then I'll die faster than they can catch me." Below, a 109 turned, its pilot confused by the sudden flash of silver climbing toward him. Riley closed the gap in seconds. The German rolled, diving, trying to use the clouds, but the Mustang stayed glued to his tail, faster than physics had any right to allow. "Come on, sweetheart," Riley muttered, throttling all the way forward. The engine howled, the frame shuddered, but the P-51 held together. He fired one burst, a clean line of tracers slicing through the 109's fuselage. The German aircraft erupted in flame. Another 109 broke high, trying to loop behind him. Riley pulled vertical, flipping over into the climb, a move no Mustang could normally manage at that altitude. But the Vance mod turned his plane into something else entirely. He rolled inverted, came down nose first and fired again. 2 kills. The last German dove hard, pulling a desperate split S toward the tree line. Riley followed, throttling back to stay behind him. The engine sputtered, coughed once, but recovered. He fired another short burst. The third Me-109 disintegrated before it could level out. The sky went quiet. The radio buzzed with static and disbelief. His wingman finally spoke. "You just took 3 alone." Riley smiled, chest heaving. "No, we did. Me and that lunatic in the hangar." When he returned to base, the ground crew was waiting. The Mustang's engine was smoking. The cowling scorched black, the smell of cooked oil thick in the air, but it was intact. Vance stood beside the runway, arms crossed. He didn't cheer when Riley climbed out. He didn't have to. He just looked at the plane and said, "She tell you anything up there?" Riley wiped sweat and oil off his forehead. "Yeah," he said, grinning. "She told me she likes to be wild." That night in the mess hall, Riley quietly updated his flight log. Altitude 30,000 feet. Pressure 80 inches. Engine temperature. God knows. Result 3 kills, 1 miracle. The next morning, a courier arrived with orders from command. Effective immediately, all Mustangs in the 357th would receive emergency throttle recalibration, authorized for use only in extreme combat. The pilots laughed when they read the memo. Extreme combat. That was every day. They didn't care what the brass called it. To them it was Vance's engine, the madman's heartbeat inside every Mustang. And for the next few weeks, that heartbeat would terrorize the Luftwaffe from the Ruhr to Berlin. German radio intercepts even gave it a name, the climb of death. Every time a Mustang went vertical, German pilots whispered the same word through trembling lips. Verflucht, cursed. But to the Americans it wasn't a curse. It was freedom made mechanical. April 1945. The war was dying, but still clawing. The Rhine River glittered below like a silver wound cutting through the wreckage of Germany. The Luftwaffe, desperate and hollow, was throwing everything it had into the air, including the new Me-262 jets. They were fast, terrifyingly fast, 540 miles per hour on straight runs. Every Allied pilot feared them. Even the Mustang aces admitted, if he sees you first, you're dead. But on that grey morning, Captain Riley saw them first. His squadron, the Oxford Boys, was escorting a crippled bomber column limping home from a raid on Regensburg. The bombers were slow, bleeding altitude, engines coughing black smoke. Then, out of the clouds, 3 silver shapes streaked in. Me 262 seconds. Jets! Bandits high too, Riley barked. His Mustangs broke formation, diving to intercept. But the jets were already in gun range. Their cannons opened up, 30mm shells shredding air, ripping into a B-17's wing. The bomber exploded, its tail spinning off in fire. "God damn it!" Riley roared. He could see the vapor trails slicing across the sky. The Mustangs couldn't match that speed, not on paper. But Riley wasn't flying by paper anymore. He reached down. The toggle switch waited under his glove, the same one wired by Silas Vance's grease-black hands months before. Click. The engine growled. The manifold gauge snapped upward. 70-75. 80 inches of boost. The cockpit trembled. The Merlin's roar turned into something deeper, stranger, like thunder being forged. "Hang on, sweetheart," Riley muttered. The Mustang leapt forward, acceleration so brutal it slammed him into the seat. He pulled up through the smoke, chasing the lead, Me 262 that had just finished its attack run. The German jet banked, expecting to outpace the pursuit. But this time, the silver blur behind him gained ground. Impossible, the jet pilot must have thought. But it wasn't. Not with Vance's forbidden fix. Riley closed to 600 yards. He aimed high, leading the target. The tracers flashed, one burst two, and then the Me 262 erupted in orange flame. Splash one jet, the other two broke off, diving for speed. Riley followed, throttle still buried, the Merlin engine shrieking at red line. The second jet tried to outrun him. Riley fired again, short burst, pure instinct. Tracers cut through the jet's left nacelle. Fire poured from its wing. It rolled inverted and disappeared into the river. "Jesus Christ, he's killing jets!" someone yelled over the radio. The last Me 262 dove hard toward the horizon. Riley gave chase, but his gauges were screaming now. Oil temperature critical, boost maxed, engine vibration off scale. He didn't care. "Come on, girl," he whispered. "Just one more." He chased the jet until both aircraft skimmed treetop level. The German weaved desperate. Riley cut throttle just enough to tighten his turn radius, something a jet couldn't do. He fired. Tracers stitched across the Me 262's fuselage. The German pilot ejected, his jet slamming into the ground a heartbeat later. 3 kills, 3 jets. When Riley finally leveled out, smoke filled his cockpit. The Merlin coughed, sputtered, and died. He glided down, landing rough on a farmer's field, dirt flying over the canopy. The plane stopped just short of a hedgerow. He sat there for a long moment, heart hammering, listening to the ticking metal as the engine cooled. Then he smiled. That same reckless, defiant, grateful smile he'd seen on Silas Vance's face the day of the madman's run. Back at Lakenheath, the radio call came through. 1 Mustang down, engine failure after contact. 3 confirmed jet kills. The hangar went silent. Mechanics looked at each other, then at Vance, who stood with his hands in his pockets, eyes on the horizon. No one spoke. "Finally," Vance said quietly, "guess we found out how fast a rule breaker can fly." That night, the colonel wired a report to Air Force Command. P-51 with unauthorized manifold modifications engaged and destroyed multiple Me 262 aircraft. Enemy speed advantage neutralized. Recommend field testing of similar configuration. They never mentioned Vance by name. They never would. But in that moment, somewhere between the Rhine and the wreckage, a single truth had been written in oil and smoke. Innovation doesn't ask permission. By May 1945, the skies over Europe were silent. The smoke from the last burning factories drifted east, and the Me 262 seconds, those sleek, terrifying machines that once promised a new era of air power, now sat abandoned on airfields, engines gutted, fuel tanks empty. The Luftwaffe's proudest dream had been undone not by superior technology, but by something far simpler, the will to push past the limits printed in red ink. When Allied engineers inspected captured German jets, they were stunned by their sophistication. Axial flow turbines, advanced alloys, 540 miles per hour's performance at altitude. But those same engineers couldn't ignore the irony. The United States, using piston engines and propellers, had won the skies. The reason wasn't in design, it was in defiance. And that defiance had a name: Sergeant Silas Ace Vance. His modification, that illegal hand-built pressure bypass, had turned the P-51 from a beautiful escort into a weapon of sheer dominance. It had done what the factories couldn't make a machine think like a man. For months, command refused to credit him. His file remained stamped, violation of procedure. Yet quietly, his blueprints, drawn on a coffee-stained napkin and later redrafted by engineers at Wright Field, became part of the next generation of high-boost systems. The same concept would power the F-80 Shooting Star, the first U.S. jet to break 500 miles per hour. What began as an act of insubordination became doctrine. Mechanics in the field called him Mad Silas. Pilots called him St. Vance. The brass called him nothing at all. But when post-war tests tried to replicate his results, they couldn't. Not perfectly, because it wasn't the metal or the pressure that made it work. It was the man, the ear tuned to vibration, the instinct that felt when a machine wanted to run, not when it was told it could. Numbers proved it anyway. Mustang combat survivability increased 23% after emergency boost authorization. Engagement range against jets reduced by 40%. Bomber losses on high-altitude raids dropped by nearly 1/3. That's the math of disobedience, the arithmetic of courage. When asked years later why he risked it all, Vance said simply, "Because I hated watching them die slow." He never received a medal. He never made officer. After the war, he went back to Michigan, tuning truck engines in a garage behind a diner. Local kids would come by just to hear him talk. One day, a young mechanic asked if the stories were true, that he'd built a Mustang that could chase down a jet. Vance smiled, wiping his hands on a rag. "No," he said. "The jet slowed down for me." He kept that same rag until the day he died, covered in the same oil that once stained his hands at Lakenheath. And when they cleared out his workbench, they found a single piece of paper nailed to the wall. It wasn't a photograph. It wasn't a medal. It was the original diagram of the bypass valve drawn in pencil, edges yellowed, signed with grease. At the bottom were 3 words in shaky handwriting: "If it breathes, push it." That was Vance's gospel. The one the manuals never printed. The one that kept men alive. Because in war, the difference between brilliance and madness isn't engineering, it's its outcome. And for Silas Vance, madness had rewritten the sky. Years later, when the world had forgotten what piston engines sounded like, an old hangar in Michigan still echoed with the ghostly rhythm of a Merlin. Inside, the air smelled of oil, dust, and faded aluminum. A rusted propeller leaned against the wall, its tips painted red, the color of warning lines that no one had respected enough to obey. The shop belonged to Silas Vance until the day he died. His tools were still there, a wrench worn smooth by decades of hands, a soldering iron blackened from 1,000 burns, a coffee mug filled with bolts instead of coffee. On the bench sat a model plane, a P-51 Mustang, not factory perfect. The paint chipped, the markings wrong, the prop hand-carved from oak. But on the side, scratched in a mechanic's shaky handwriting, were 4 words: "Built wrong. Flew right." Every veteran who visited him after the war told the same story. They'd walk into that hangar and hear the hum, that faint, phantom vibration that seemed to live in the air. Some swore they could still hear the throttle open, the engine growl, the moment the red line disappeared. When Vance died in 1967, the men he'd once saved, pilots, crew chiefs, gunners, came from all over. They gathered not in a church but in that hangar. Someone played the sound of a Merlin startup from an old tape recorder. For a few seconds, the air filled again with that raw, deep, confident, alive. No words were needed. In the decades that followed, as aviation historians would write endless books about the P-51 Mustang, its speed, its range, its elegance, they would speak of laminar wings, Packard-built engines, and the industrial miracle that made them. But buried deep in the archives, in a report stamped Field Modification Unauthorized 1944, lies a forgotten truth. The most important advance of the air war didn't come from engineers in lab coats. It came from a man with a wrench, a cigarette, and the courage to listen to the machine. Silas Vance never wanted fame. He just wanted engines to run right, even if that meant breaking every rule written by men who'd never faced death at 20,000 feet. In the end, that's how he'll be remembered. Not as a rebel, but as the man who taught steel to breathe. Because the real miracle of World War II wasn't just the planes or the bombs or the factories. It was the people who refused to let perfection stand in the way of survival. When the manuals failed, men like Vance made new ones in pencil, in grease, in courage. And somewhere, if you listen close enough to an old engine's idle, you can still hear his voice. Engines don't care about orders. They care about being alive. The sky he helped win was never just about altitude or airspeed. It was about will, human will welded to metal and unleashed without fear.